When my wife died, her wealthy boss called me and said, "Calvin, I found something. Come to my office right now." Then he added, "Do not tell your son or your daughter-in-law. You could be in grave danger." When I got there and saw who was standing at the door, I froze. My blood turned to ice, and I realized my wife did not just die. She was taken from me. But before I tell you what I found in that office, you need to understand how the day of her funeral became the day my own son declared war on me. My name is Calvin Pierce, and I am 68 years old. I spent 40 years managing logistics in a Cleveland warehouse, moving everything from auto parts to medical supplies through the Great Lakes shipping routes. Before that, I carried an M16 for this country in the Mekong Delta from 1968 to 1969, where I learned that survival depends on reading people and situations correctly. I know how to spot trouble before it finds you, and I know when a storm is coming. But nothing in two wars, the one in Vietnam and the one in my own living room afterward, prepared me for the storm that walked into St. Matthew's Lutheran Church that humid Tuesday morning in July. I sat in the front pew staring at the mahogany casket that held Linda, my Linda. We had been married for 45 years since I came back from Southeast Asia with shrapnel in my leg and nightmares that took 5 years to quiet down. She was a small woman, barely 5'2", with hands that showed the wear of honest work, but a mind sharp enough to cut glass. For 35 years, she had managed the household and financial affairs of Preston Hawthorne, one of Cleveland's old steel fortune families. While I moved boxes and supervised loading docks, Linda balanced investment portfolios worth more money than most people see in a lifetime. The thing about Linda was that she made rich people feel comfortable. She knew when to speak and when to disappear into the woodwork. She organized their charity galas, managed their domestic staff, and somehow convinced a man worth $50 million to trust her with access to accounts that could buy a small country. Preston Hawthorne hadn't left his Shaker Heights estate in 5 years, not since his stroke, but he trusted Linda Pierce from Maple Street to handle everything from his medication schedule to his stock trades. The organ music was soft that morning, a low hymn that vibrated through the wooden pews and made my chest feel hollow. St. Matthew's was filling up with neighbors from our blue-collar street, people from the church choir, and even some of Mr. Hawthorne's household staff who had driven down from the mansion to pay their respects. Everyone was dressed in their Sunday best, whispering in respectful tones about what a good woman Linda had been, how she'd helped this family through hard times or that family find work when the steel plants started closing. Everyone was there except the 2 people who should have been sitting right next to me, sharing my grief, helping me carry the weight of this day. My son Wesley and his wife Sharon were late, not fashionably late, not caught in traffic late. They were 40 minutes late to their own mother's funeral. The service had already begun. Pastor Muller was already reading from Ecclesiastes about there being a time for everything under heaven, when the heavy oak doors at the back of the sanctuary suddenly banged open like someone had kicked them. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. But I didn't have to see to know what was happening behind me. I heard the sharp, aggressive clack of high heels against the stone floor, each step echoing through the church like gunshots in a library. I felt the collective intake of breath from 200 people who understood that something inappropriate was happening, but weren't sure what to do about it. Heads turned. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Even Pastor Mueller paused in his reading and looked toward the back of the church with an expression that managed to be both welcoming and concerned. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead on the spray of white lilies covering Linda's casket. White lilies had been her favorite flower since we were young. She'd plant them every spring in the narrow strip of dirt between our front porch and the sidewalk, tending them like they were made of gold instead of petals and stem. Now they were the last thing she'd ever see, and I was trying to memorize every detail of how they looked in the soft light filtering through the stained glass windows, but I could smell them before I saw them. Wesley and Sharon announced themselves with a cloud of expensive perfume and cologne that seemed to push against the gentle scent of the flowers and the old wood of the church pews. It was too much fragrance, too strong, the kind of smell that comes from people who think money can cover up other odors, like fear, like guilt, like the stale cigarette smoke that clung to Sharon's hair no matter how much she tried to hide it. Then Wesley slid into the pew beside me. Wearing a cream-colored suit that looked like something a Las Vegas card dealer would wear to work, not something a son would wear to his mother's funeral. The fabric was shiny, expensive, but completely wrong for the occasion. It was the kind of suit that screamed money but whispered poor judgment. He didn't touch my shoulder. He didn't squeeze my hand in shared grief. He didn't even glance toward the casket where his mother lay, surrounded by the flowers she'd loved. Instead, he pulled out his smartphone. In a church. During his mother's funeral. During the pastor's reading of scripture. The screen lit up in the dim sanctuary, a harsh blue rectangle that seemed to suck the reverence right out of the air. Wesley's thumbs moved across the keyboard with urgent, jerky motions. His jaw was clenched tight enough to crack teeth. I glanced sideways and saw beads of sweat forming on his forehead despite the air conditioning that hummed quietly through. The old building. This wasn't grief sweat. This wasn't the perspiration of a man overwhelmed by loss. This was the cold, clammy sweat of a man who was cornered, a man who was running out of time and options. Sharon squeezed into the pew next to him, and if Wesley looked inappropriate, Sharon looked like she'd gotten dressed for a cocktail party instead of a funeral. She was a 38-year-old white woman from Parma Heights who had grown up in a split-level ranch house but had spent the last 10 years trying to convince the world she'd been born in a penthouse. Her black dress was designer, I could tell, but it was too short for church and too tight for a woman attending her mother-in-law's funeral. She wore enormous black sunglasses that covered half her face, which might have looked stylish at a Hollywood premiere but looked ridiculous indoors in the soft lighting of St. Matthew's. She fanned herself with the funeral program, making a show of her discomfort while looking around the sanctuary with barely concealed disdain. I watched her eyes sweep over the hand-carved wooden cross above the altar, the simple stained glass windows that Linda had helped the congregation save money to install 20 years ago, the worn but clean carpet that had been donated by parishioners who worked in the flooring business. To Sharon, this wasn't a sacred space where a good woman was being honored. This was a shabby, outdated building filled with people who didn't matter. "This place is like a sauna," she whispered, but her voice carried the way voices do in acoustically designed spaces. Half the choir turned to look at her. Didn't they have money for proper air conditioning? "Shh," Wesley hissed, but he didn't put the phone away. His fingers kept moving across the screen, typing what looked like increasingly desperate messages to someone on the other end. I gripped the handle of my cane so hard my knuckles went white. The cane was carved hickory, cut from a tree on my father's property in rural Ohio and shaped by my own hands during the long months of physical therapy after I came back from Vietnam with metal fragments in my left thigh. It was solid, practical, strong enough to support a man's weight or to serve other purposes if necessary. Right then, I wanted to use it to knock some sense into both of them, but I had spent 40 years learning to control my temper and 68 years learning when to pick my battles. This was Linda's day. This was her send-off, her moment to be remembered and honored by the people who had known her and loved her. I would not let their selfishness and disrespect turn her funeral into a scene. I was a man of discipline, trained first by drill sergeants who taught me that emotional control could mean the difference between life and death, and later by union supervisors who taught me that keeping your mouth shut at the wrong moment could cost you your job and your family's security. But sitting there listening to Sharon complain about the temperature while Wesley conducted business on his phone during the reading of the 23rd Psalm, I felt something cold and hard settling in my chest. It wasn't grief, though grief was there too. It wasn't anger, though anger was building like pressure in a steam pipe. It was recognition. I was finally seeing my son and his wife clearly, maybe for the first time since they'd gotten married 8 years ago. The service continued around us. Pastor Mueller spoke about Linda's devotion to her family, her quiet generosity to neighbors in need, her 35 years of faithful service that had earned her not just a paycheck, but genuine respect from one of Cleveland's wealthiest families. He talked about her faith, her kindness, her habit of leaving anonymous groceries on doorsteps when she heard through the church network that someone was struggling. People nodded. A few wiped away tears. Mrs. Henderson from next door dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, remembering how Linda had helped her through her husband's cancer treatments. Mr. Torres from the corner market smiled sadly, thinking about how Linda always asked about his grandchildren and remembered their birthdays. But Wesley kept texting, and Sharon kept fanning herself and sighing dramatically. The service ended with a hymn that Linda had chosen herself before she died, "How Great Thou Art." And as the congregation's voices rose in the familiar melody, I noticed that Wesley and Sharon didn't sing, they didn't even stand. Wesley was still hunched over his phone, and Sharon was checking her makeup in a compact mirror she'd pulled from her purse. After the closing prayer, we moved to the fellowship hall for the repast. The church ladies had been cooking since dawn, preparing all of Linda's favorite foods in quantities large enough to feed the neighborhood. The long tables groaned under the weight of fried chicken that had been seasoned with recipes passed down through generations. Collard greens slow-cooked with ham hocks, macaroni and cheese baked until the top was golden brown and bubbling, and cornbread that was still warm from the oven. The smell should have been comforting, should have reminded me of Sunday dinners and church potlucks and all the times Linda had stood in our own kitchen, humming while she cooked for people she loved. But watching Sharon's reaction to the food made my stomach turn. She stood near the wall holding a paper plate between two fingers like it might contaminate her if she gripped it properly. Her face was twisted in an expression of barely concealed disgust as she surveyed the offerings that represented hours of loving preparation by women who had known Linda for decades. I took my usual spot in the corner, a folding chair someone had thoughtfully placed where I could rest my leg and observe the room. My hearing aids were turned up high, a trick I'd learned over the years that let people think I was just another deaf old man while I actually heard every conversation around me. Most folks underestimate the elderly, assume we're too far gone to understand what's happening in our own lives. It's a useful misconception sometimes. Sharon leaned in close to Wesley, close enough that her perfume probably made his eyes water. Her voice was low, but not nearly low enough. "I can't believe we have to eat this grease," she hissed. "My stomach is turning just looking at it. And look at these people, Wesley. This whole thing is so cheap, so tacky. Where did all her money go? You said she had savings. You said she was sitting on a pile of cash." Wesley's mouth was full of chicken he hadn't bothered to bless or even acknowledge the women who had prepared it. "She spent it on pills," he muttered, his voice thick with resentment. "Doctor visits, medications, physical therapy. Old people are expensive to keep alive." "Well, at least that expense is gone now," Sharon said. And then she did something that made my heart stop completely. She laughed. It was a small sound, barely more than a giggle, but it was cruel and satisfied and utterly without shame. "That's $400 a month back in our pockets. More if you count the doctor visits." The room didn't actually stop moving around me, but it felt like it did. I could see Mrs. Johnson refilling the tea pitchers, could see Pastor Mueller shaking hands with the Henderson family, could see children from the neighborhood playing quietly in the corner while their parents talked in hushed voices about memories of Linda. But all I could hear was the echo of Sharon's laugh. All I could feel was a rage so pure and white-hot that it felt like molten metal in my veins. My wife was not even in the ground yet. The dirt was still fresh on her casket, which wouldn't be lowered into the earth for another hour when the family gathered for the private committal service. And they were celebrating. They were calculating the money they'd save now that she was dead. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling, but not from age or infirmity. They were shaking from the effort it took to keep them folded in my lap instead of wrapped around someone's throat. In Vietnam, I'd learned that the most dangerous moment in combat wasn't when you were scared. It was when you were angry. Angry soldiers made mistakes. Angry soldiers got themselves and their buddies killed. I'd spent 50 years since then learning to channel that anger, to use it as fuel instead of letting it burn me up from the inside. But this was different. This wasn't enemy fire or a bad order from an incompetent lieutenant. This was my son and his wife talking about my Linda like she'd been a burden they were happy to see gone. The room began to clear out as people finished eating and paying their respects. Neighbors stopped by my chair to shake my hand, to tell me how sorry they were for my loss, to share brief memories of Linda's kindness. I nodded and thanked them, going through the motions of gracious grief, but my eyes never left Wesley. He was pacing near the exit like a caged animal, checking his watch every 30 seconds, glancing at his phone, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the air conditioning. When the last guest had gathered their things and headed home, when the church ladies had started wrapping leftovers and cleaning dishes, Wesley finally approached me. He didn't ask how I was holding up. He didn't offer to drive me home or help me with anything. He stood over me, blocking the fluorescent light, casting a shadow across my chair. "Dad," he said, his voice flat and businesslike, "where's the key to Mom's safe?" I looked up at Wesley slowly, taking in every detail of his face. The bags under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, the twitch in his left cheek that started whenever he was lying or under pressure, the way his hands shook slightly when he thought no one was watching. This was my boy, the child I had taught to fish in Lake Erie on summer mornings when the water was calm and the city was quiet. The boy Linda had rocked to sleep during thunderstorms, singing old hymns in her soft voice until his breathing became steady and peaceful. Now he looked at me like I was an ATM that had malfunctioned, like a machine that was keeping him from accessing something that belonged to him. "What did you say?" I asked, my voice coming out rougher than I intended. "The safe key," Wesley repeated, louder this time, his patience already wearing thin. "Sharon says Mom had a life insurance policy. We need to check the paperwork. We're entitled to 50% as next of kin, and there are immediate expenses that need to be handled." Sharon stepped up beside him, crossing her arms and putting on what she probably thought was a concerned expression. "We need to start the probate process immediately, Calvin. Funerals are expensive, and we have bills that can't wait. We know Linda was practical about money. She would have wanted us to be practical too." I stood up slowly, using my cane for support, but also to buy myself time to think. My knees protested, the legacy of too many years loading trucks and the shrapnel that still shifted sometimes in my left thigh when the weather changed. Even bent with age, I still had 4 inches on Sharon and could look Wesley eye to eye. There had been a time when my son had looked up to me, literally and figuratively. Now he met my gaze with something that looked dangerously close to contempt. "Your mother isn't even cold yet," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "The dirt isn't settled on her grave, and you're asking about money." "It's not about money, it's about responsibility," Wesley snapped back. "It's about asset management. Don't be difficult, Dad. We both know you don't understand finances. You worked in a warehouse your whole life. Mom handled all the money decisions, all the planning. She would have wanted us to take care of things properly." "Help?" I couldn't keep the scorn out of my voice. "You want to help? You show up 40 minutes late to your mother's funeral, spend the service texting, and now you're demanding keys to her personal belongings. That's not help, Wesley. That's grave robbing." Wesley stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the nervous sweat beneath his expensive cologne. His eyes had gone wild, desperate in a way that reminded me of the junkies I'd sometimes encountered during my years working the night shift at the warehouse. But this wasn't drug desperation. This was something else. Something that made my trained instincts start sending up warning signals. "Listen to me, old man," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow seemed more threatening than if he'd shouted. "You don't understand what's going on here. This house is in trouble. We're in trouble. If we don't find that money by the end of the week, things are going to get very bad for all of us." "What kind of bad?" I asked, though part of me already knew I didn't want to hear the answer. "The kind where you end up on the street," Wesley spat. "The kind where this house gets sold out from under you to cover debts you don't even know exist. Now give me the damn key, or I'll turn this place upside down until I find it myself." He reached toward my jacket pocket where I kept my key ring. It was an automatic, presumptuous gesture that told me everything I needed to know about how he saw our relationship now. In his mind, I was no longer his father. I was an obstacle between him and whatever he thought he needed. I moved faster than I had in years, faster than a 68-year-old man with a bad leg should have been able to move. My hand shot out and caught his wrist before his fingers could reach my pocket. My grip was still strong from decades of manual labor, strong enough to make him wince and try to pull away. "Get your hands off me," I said quietly. Sharon gasped like I'd struck her instead of simply defending myself. "He's losing his mind," she shrieked, her voice echoing through the fellowship hall where a few church ladies were still cleaning up. "Calvin, you're being irrational. We're trying to help you, and you're becoming violent. This is exactly what we were worried about." "We'll discuss this later, Sharon," Wesley said, finally managing to jerk his hand free from my grip. He was rubbing his wrist, and I could see the red marks where my fingers had pressed into his skin. "Dad, you have until tonight to think about this reasonably. If I don't have access to Mom's financial records by tomorrow morning, I'm calling Adult Protective Services. I'll tell them you're not competent to live alone anymore. I'll have you declared unfit." He turned and walked toward the exit, his expensive shoes clicking against the linoleum floor. Sharon shot me one last look of pure hatred before following him, her heels echoing his rhythm like a countdown timer. I stood alone in the fellowship hall after they left, surrounded by the lingering smells of home cooking and the quiet sounds of church ladies cleaning up after a meal that had been prepared with love and served with respect. The contrast between their kindness and my son's cruelty was so sharp it felt like a physical pain in my chest. Mrs. Patterson, the pastor's wife, approached with a concerned expression. "Calvin, honey, are you all right? You look a little pale." "I'm fine, Margaret." "Just tired," I managed to say, though fine was about as far from the truth as I could get. She patted my arm gently. "You call us if you need anything, you hear? Don't try to handle everything by yourself. Linda wouldn't want that." After the ladies finished cleaning and locked up the church, I sat in my old Ford pickup in the parking lot for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. The truck was a 1990 F-150 with 280,000 miles on it, rust around the wheel wells, and a passenger door that stuck when the weather was humid. But the engine was solid, the transmission was strong, and it had never once failed to start when I needed it to. In a world where everything seemed to be falling apart, that reliability meant something. My phone buzzed in my breast pocket. The screen was cracked. Had been for 6 months since I'd dropped it getting out of the truck at the VA clinic, but I could still read the display clearly enough. The caller ID made my heart skip. Preston Hawthorne. In the 5 years since his stroke had confined him to a wheelchair, Mr. Hawthorne hadn't called me directly more than 3 times. Linda had always been his contact, his bridge to the world outside his estate. "Mr. Hawthorne," I answered, my voice still rough from the confrontation with Wesley. "Calvin." His voice was different from what I remembered. Where it had once been smooth and commanding, the voice of a man who had built a manufacturing empire from his grandfather's small machine shop. Now it was jagged, breathless. "Calvin, I need you to listen to me very carefully." "Sir?" I was going through Linda's office here at the house, the safe she kept in the back room behind my study. She had her own combination, you understand. I never asked what she kept there. Linda's business was Linda's business, and she'd earned that privacy. But with her gone... He paused, and I heard him take a shaky breath. "Calvin, she left something for you. A journal. And a recording. I think you need to see this immediately." "A recording of what?" "Just come to the estate. Use the service entrance on Coventry Road. The gate will be open. And Calvin?" "Yes, sir. Don't go home first. Don't stop anywhere. And for the love of God, don't tell Wesley or that woman he married that you're coming here." The line went quiet for a moment, and when Mr. Hawthorne spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Calvin, I don't think Linda died of natural causes." The words hit me like a physical blow. The parking lot seemed to tilt, and I gripped the steering wheel to steady myself. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying they didn't just wait for her to die. I'm saying they helped her along." I sat in that truck for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, trying to process what I'd just heard. Linda had been taking medication for her heart condition for almost 10 years. Her doctor had been monitoring her closely, adjusting dosages, adding new prescriptions as her condition changed. She'd been careful about her diet, walking every morning before work, taking her pills exactly as prescribed. But in the weeks before she died, she'd been different. Quieter. More watchful. She'd started locking her purse in her car instead of leaving it on the kitchen counter like she always had. She'd changed the password on her laptop. Small things. But now that I thought about it, they formed a pattern. I started the truck and pulled out of the church parking lot, but instead of heading home to Maple Street, I turned north toward Shaker Heights. The neighborhoods changed as I drove, from modest post-war houses with small lawns and chain-link fences to sprawling properties with circular driveways and gates that cost more than most people's cars. The Hawthorne estate sat on 15 acres of manicured grounds, hidden behind stone walls that had been built when Cleveland was still growing into its industrial strength. Old money in Cleveland was different from new money. It was quieter, more established, tied to names that appeared on hospital wings and university buildings rather than gossip columns. Linda had worked in this world for 35 years, but she'd never been seduced by it. She'd come home every evening to our little house on Maple Street, hung up her work clothes, and put on jeans and one of my old work shirts to cook dinner or tend her small garden. She'd never acted like she was better than our neighbors, never put on airs, never forgot where she came from. But she'd also never talked much about what she did during those long days behind the estate's walls. I pulled up to the service entrance on Coventry Road, a discreet gate hidden behind mature oak trees that was used by delivery trucks and household staff. True to Mr. Hawthorne's word, the electronic gate stood open, though I could see security cameras tracking my movement as I drove through. The service road wound through carefully maintained gardens, past a greenhouse that looked bigger than most people's houses, and around to the back of the main residence where deliveries were made and staff entered. Mr. Hawthorne was waiting for me at the service door, his wheelchair positioned so he could see my approach. At 80 years old, his body had been ravaged by the stroke and the years that followed, but his eyes remained sharp as broken glass. He wore a burgundy velvet smoking jacket and a silk scarf despite the July heat, and when he extended his hand to greet me, his grip was surprisingly strong for a man who looked like a strong breeze might knock him over. "Calvin," he said simply, "thank you for coming. I know this day has been difficult enough without adding to your burden." I followed his wheelchair through hallways I'd never seen before, past rooms filled with antique furniture and oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors who had built Cleveland's industrial empire. The house was massive, with ceilings that soared 20 feet high and windows that looked out over grounds that seemed to stretch forever. It was beautiful, but it felt cold without Linda's presence to warm it. We passed the main study where I knew Linda had worked, organizing Mr. Hawthorne's correspondence and managing his investments. The door was closed, but I could picture her there, sitting at the massive mahogany desk with her reading glasses perched on her nose, carefully reviewing financial statements and making notes in her precise handwriting. Mr. Hawthorne led me to a smaller room behind the study, a space that had clearly been Linda's private office. The furniture was simpler here, more functional. A desk with multiple filing cabinets, a computer that looked newer than anything in our house, and walls lined with binders and folders organized with the kind of attention to detail that had made Linda invaluable to Mr. Hawthorne's business operations. But we weren't alone in the room. Standing by the window was a tall man in his 50s wearing a rumpled trench coat despite the summer weather. He had the kind of face that had seen too much of the wrong side of life. Scarred, weathered, with eyes that looked like they'd spent time at the bottom of both bottles and humanity. When he turned to look at me, I saw a professional wariness that I recognized from my own military training. "Calvin, this is Marshal Kane," Mr. Hawthorne said. "He's a private investigator. Linda hired him 2 months ago." The words hit me like a physical blow. Linda had hired a private investigator? Why? What had she suspected? What had she discovered? Marshall nodded at me, his expression mixing pity with respect in a way that told me he'd seen this kind of family destruction before. "Mr. Pierce," he said, his voice gravelly from too many cigarettes and too many late nights. "I'm sorry for your loss. Your wife was a brave woman." "Brave?" I asked, confusion mixing with grief. "What do you mean, brave?" Mr. Hawthorne wheeled himself behind Linda's desk and placed his hands on a small stack of items that had been carefully arranged on the green desk blotter. I could see a small black leather journal that I recognized immediately. Linda's prayer journal, the one she'd carried in her purse for as long as I'd known her. Next to it was a thick manila envelope and what looked like a small digital recording device. "Calvin," Mr. Hawthorne said softly, "Linda came to me in May. She was frightened. She said money was disappearing from your household accounts, small amounts at first, then larger ones. She suspected Wesley, but she couldn't prove it." He pushed the journal toward me across the desk. "She started keeping records, not just of the missing money, but of other things. Conversations she'd overheard, behavior that worried her. She documented everything." My hands were shaking as I reached for the journal. The leather was warm, as if Linda had just been holding it, just been writing in it with the careful penmanship I'd watched her use for 45 years. I opened it to a page marked with a ribbon bookmark. The entry was dated just 3 weeks before she died. Linda's handwriting was neat as always, but I could see the stress in the way certain words were pressed harder into the paper, in the slight tremor that hadn't been there in earlier entries. "Wesley came by again today while Calvin was at his doctor's appointment," I read aloud, my voice cracking. "He wanted money for what he called a business investment. When I said no, he got angry in a way that scared me. He said I was being selfish, that I was sitting on money that should belong to the family. He said I wouldn't live forever, and that I should think about what would happen to Calvin if I weren't around to take care of things." I stopped reading. The room seemed to be spinning around me, and I had to grip the edge of the desk to steady myself. "There's more," Marshall said gently. Keep reading. I forced myself to focus on the page, on Linda's careful documentation of what had become her final weeks of life. I found pills in his jacket pocket when he hung it on the kitchen chair. They looked exactly like my metoprolol, but something felt wrong about them. The color was slightly off, and they felt different when I rolled one between my fingers. I put them back, but I'm scared. I'm scared of my own son. The journal fell from my hands and landed on the desk with a soft thud. I looked up at Mr. Hawthorne, then at Marshall Kane, then back at the journal that contained my wife's growing fear of the child we'd raised together. She suspected Wesley was replacing her heart medication, Marshall said, his voice matter-of-fact but not unkind. She hired me to investigate, to document what was happening, to gather evidence that could be used to protect both of you. Evidence of what? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. Evidence of attempted murder, Mr. Hawthorne said quietly. And Calvin, we found it. Marshall reached for the manila envelope and spread its contents across the desk with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent years documenting human betrayal. Dozens of photographs spilled out, taken with the kind of long-range lens that could capture details from across a parking lot or through a kitchen window. The images were grainy but clear enough to stop my heart cold. The first photo showed Wesley standing in the alley behind Riverside Casino, a gambling den on Cleveland's east side that had been shut down twice by police raids but always seemed to reopen under new management. He was handing a thick wad of cash to a man with elaborate tattoos covering his neck and arms. Even in the poor lighting, I could see the desperation in my son's posture, the way he kept glancing over his shoulder like he expected trouble. This was taken 6 weeks ago, Marshall explained, his voice professional but not without sympathy. Your son owes money to Vincent Romano, who runs illegal sports betting operations throughout the Great Lakes region. Romano's not the kind of man you want to owe money to. The second photo showed Wesley and Sharon sitting in the front seat of his leased BMW, parked outside our house on Maple Street. Sharon was holding a bottle of champagne, her head thrown back in laughter, while Wesley counted what looked like a substantial amount of cash. The timestamp showed it was taken the day after Linda had mentioned missing money from their checking account. But it was the third photo that made my knees buckle. I had to grab the edge of the desk to keep from falling. It was taken through our kitchen window at 2:17 a.m., just 4 nights before Linda died. The timestamp was clear in the bottom right corner, and the night vision photography made everything look green and otherworldly, but the scene was unmistakable. Wesley was standing at our kitchen counter where Linda kept her daily pill organizer, the plastic container with separate compartments for each day of the week that helped her keep track of her heart medication, blood pressure pills, and vitamins. In his hands, Wesley held 2 orange prescription bottles. One I recognized as Linda's metoprolol, the beta blocker she'd been taking for years to regulate her heart rhythm. The other bottle was unlabeled, generic, the kind you might get from an online pharmacy or a street dealer. Wesley was carefully pouring pills from the unlabeled bottle into Linda's daily organizer, replacing her life-saving medication with something else entirely. What made the image truly horrifying was the expression on Wesley's face. He wasn't crying, he wasn't hesitating, he wasn't showing any sign of internal conflict about what he was doing. He was smiling. It was a small, satisfied smile, the expression of a man who thought he was solving all his problems with one simple action. We had surveillance on your house for the last month of Linda's life, Marshall continued, his voice steady despite the horror of what he was describing. She suspected something was wrong with her medication. She'd been feeling different, experiencing symptoms that didn't match her medical condition. Her doctor had adjusted her dosage several times, but the problems persisted. Mr. Hawthorne leaned forward in his wheelchair, his age-spotted hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Calvin, Linda was not just my employee, she was my friend. In 35 years, she never once betrayed my trust, never once failed to protect my interests. When she came to me scared, when she asked for help investigating her own family, I knew the situation was serious. I stared at the photo of my son poisoning my wife, the boy I had carried on my shoulders when he was small, the teenager I had taught to drive, the young man whose college education Linda and I had sacrificed to pay for. He had used a key we'd given him for emergencies to sneak into our house in the middle of the night and systematically murder the woman who had given him life. What was in the pills? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Marshall pulled out a toxicology report from a folder. We managed to retrieve some of the substitute medication from your trash after one of Wesley's visits. Street-grade amphetamines mixed with caffeine pills. For someone with Linda's heart condition, taking these instead of her prescribed beta blockers would be like injecting poison directly into her bloodstream. The technical language couldn't mask the brutal reality. Wesley had researched his mother's medical condition, figured out exactly what kind of drugs would interact fatally with her heart problems, and then systematically replaced her medication over a period of weeks. It wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of desperate rage. It was calculated, premeditated murder carried out with the patience of a professional killer. "How long?" I asked. "We think he'd been replacing her pills for almost 3 weeks before she died," Mr. Hawthorne said softly. "Long enough to make it look like a natural progression of her condition. Long enough that even her doctor wouldn't suspect anything unusual." I thought about those final weeks of Linda's life, how she'd complained about feeling dizzy, about her heart racing at unexpected times, about chest pains that seemed different from her usual symptoms. I'd encouraged her to call her doctor, had even offered to drive her to appointments, but she'd insisted she was fine, that it was probably just stress from dealing with Wesley's constant demands for money. She had been dying slowly, painfully, while living in the same house as the person who was killing her. And she had known. The journal entries made it clear that she had suspected, had been gathering evidence, had been trying to protect both of us from the son who had decided we were worth more dead than alive. "Why?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. Marshall reached for another folder, this one thick with bank statements, credit reports, and financial documents. "Your son owes Vincent Romano $250,000. The deadline for payment is this Friday, 3 days from now. If he doesn't pay, they'll kill him," I finished. "Probably. But not quickly." I stood up from the chair so fast it nearly toppled backward. The rage that had been building in my chest since the funeral suddenly exploded into something white-hot and murderous. My hand instinctively moved toward my back waistband where I still carried the .38 Special I'd carried in Vietnam, the one I'd kept clean and loaded for 50 years in case I ever needed it again. "I'm going to kill him," I said, the words coming out in a growl that didn't sound like my own voice. "I'm going to drive back to that house and put a bullet in his head while he's sitting on my couch. Then I'm going to find Vincent Romano and do the same thing to him." "Calvin, no!" Mr. Hawthorne's voice cracked through the air like a whip. "If you do that, you'll spend the rest of your life in prison, and Wesley wins. He becomes the victim, the grieving son whose father lost his mind and committed murder. Sharon inherits everything, spends Linda's money on vacations and jewelry while you rot in a cell." Marshall stepped between me and the door, his hands raised in a calming gesture. "Mr. Pierce, I understand the impulse. I've seen this kind of family betrayal before, and the urge for immediate justice is natural. But we need to be smarter than that. We need to trap him properly." "What do you mean, trap him?" Mr. Hawthorne wheeled himself closer to the desk where Linda's journal lay open. "We have evidence, Calvin, but not enough for a conviction. A defense lawyer would argue that the photos are circumstantial, that there could be innocent explanations. We need more. We need a confession." "How do you expect to get that?" I asked, though I was starting to understand where this conversation was heading. "You have to go back there," Marshall said. "You have to go back to that house and play the part Wesley expects to see. The grieving, confused old man who doesn't understand what's happening around him. You have to make him think he's won." The idea of sitting across from Wesley, of sharing a meal with him, of pretending I didn't know he'd murdered my wife, made my stomach turn. But I'd spent 2 years in Vietnam learning that sometimes the mission required you to do things that went against every instinct you had. Sometimes survival meant becoming someone you didn't want to be. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked. Mr. Hawthorne reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small digital recording device, no bigger than a matchbox. "This is military-grade surveillance equipment. It records continuously for up to 72 hours and uploads everything to a secure server. Linda was supposed to wear it to gather evidence, but..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Linda had run out of time before she could use it. "You wear this," Marshall continued, "and you get Wesley talking. You make him think you're weak, that you're not a threat. Let him get comfortable, let his guard down. When people think they're safe, they say things they shouldn't. And if he doesn't confess, if he's smarter than we think, then we go with what we have," Mr. Hawthorne said. "The photos, Linda's journal, the toxicology report on the substitute pills, it might be enough. But a confession would guarantee justice. I thought about Linda's last weeks, about her fear and confusion as her own son slowly poisoned her. I thought about her trying to protect me even as she was dying, leaving behind evidence and hiring a private investigator because she knew I'd need help that I was too trusting to seek myself. "How long do I have to keep this up?" I asked. "Wesley's deadline with Romano is Friday," Marshall said. "Today is Tuesday. If we're right about his desperation, he'll make his move soon. He needs you to sign financial documents, needs access to whatever money he thinks Linda left behind." Mr. Hawthorne opened another folder and pulled out what looked like legal documents. "We've prepared a fake trust fund. On paper, it shows Linda leaving $1.8 million to you, with specific conditions that require competency testing and legal verification. If Wesley is as desperate as we think, he'll do anything to get his hands on that money. But there's no real trust fund?" Linda was careful with money, but she wasn't sitting on millions, Mr. Hawthorne explained. She had savings, investments, the house is paid off. "You'll be comfortable, Calvin, but not rich. This is just bait for the trap." I looked at the recording device, then at the photos of Wesley poisoning Linda, then at her journal with its careful documentation of her growing fear. My wife had been braver than I'd known, more prepared than I'd imagined. She'd seen the danger coming and had tried to build a case that would protect us both. The least I could do was finish what she'd started. "What if he gets violent?" I asked. "What if he decides to speed things up?" Marshall reached into his coat and pulled out a compact pistol. "Take this. It's clean, untraceable. If things go wrong, if you're in immediate danger, use it, but only as a last resort." I took the gun, checked the chamber, felt the familiar weight of deadly steel in my hand. It had been decades since I'd held a weapon with the intention of possibly using it, but some skills never fade. Some instincts stay sharp, no matter how long you try to bury them. "There's something else," Mr. Hawthorne said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Linda recorded a message for you. She made it 2 days before she died, just in case." He handed me a small digital player and a set of headphones. "Listen to this when you get home, when you're alone. It will help you understand what she wanted, what she was fighting for." I put the device in my pocket next to the recorder and the backup pistol. I was going back to that house armed with Linda's love, her courage, and her determination to see justice done. Wesley thought he was dealing with a broken old man. He was about to discover he'd declared war on a soldier who'd been underestimated before. The drive back to Maple Street felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. Every traffic light, every stop sign, every turn felt like another step toward a confrontation I wasn't sure I was prepared for. The recording device felt heavy in my shirt pocket, and the backup pistol Marshall had given me pressed against my spine like a cold reminder of how dangerous this game was about to become. I parked in my own driveway and sat in the truck for a moment, gathering myself. The house looked the same as it had that morning. Yellow aluminum siding that Linda had insisted on painting herself 5 years ago, the small front porch where she'd grown her tomatoes in clay, pots, the mailbox I'd installed when we first moved in 43 years ago. But knowing what I knew now, it felt like looking at a crime scene. Before I got out, I put on the headphones Mr. Hawthorne had given me and pressed play on Linda's final message. Her voice filled my ears, clear and strong despite being recorded just 2 days before she died. "Calvin, if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone and you're in danger. I'm sorry I didn't tell you what I suspected, but I was afraid. Not of dying. I made my peace with that possibility weeks ago. I was afraid of what it would do to you to know that our son was capable of murder." I closed my eyes and let her words wash over me. Even in a recording, even speaking about the darkest fears of her final days, Linda's voice carried the same calm strength that had sustained our marriage for 45 years. "I want you to know that I'm not afraid anymore. I've documented everything, given Mr. Hawthorne all the evidence he'll need to protect you. Wesley thinks he's been clever, but he's made mistakes. They always do when they think they're smarter than everyone else." She paused, and I could hear her take a shaky breath before continuing. "Don't let anger make you do something stupid, Calvin. I know you, and I know the soldier in you wants to solve this with violence, but we're better than that. We've always been better than that. Use your head, not your heart. Get him to confess, then let the law handle the rest." Another pause, longer this time. "And Calvin, when this is over, When justice is done, I want you to live. Really live. Take that trip to Ireland we always talked about. Buy a boat and fish Lake Erie every morning if you want to. Don't spend your remaining years mourning me. I had a good life, a full life, and most of that was because of you." The recording ended, and I sat in my truck crying like I hadn't cried since I came home from Vietnam. Linda had known she was going to die, had accepted it, and had spent her final days not feeling sorry for herself but trying to protect me from the aftermath. She'd been the strongest person I'd ever known, and I'd never fully appreciated it until she was gone. I wiped my eyes, put the headphones away, and walked toward my own front door. It felt like walking into enemy territory. The door was unlocked, which should have been my first warning that things had already gone wrong. Linda had been religious about locking doors, a habit she'd developed during the years when Cleveland's crime rate was climbing and our neighborhood was changing. I stepped inside and immediately knew that my house was no longer my home. The living room had been ransacked, not violently but thoroughly. Couch cushions had been removed and stacked neatly to one side. Books had been taken from shelves and piled on the coffee table. The drawers of Linda's antique desk were open, their contents spread across the floor in organized piles. "Dad, is that you?" Wesley's voice came from the kitchen, casual and friendly, like nothing unusual was happening. I found him sitting at the kitchen table with a legal pad covered in notes and a calculator. Spread around him were bank statements, insurance documents, and what looked like every piece of financial paperwork Linda and I had accumulated over 4 decades of marriage. He'd been going through our private documents like he was preparing taxes. "There you are," he said, looking up with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I was starting to worry. "How was the graveside service?" "It was fine," I said carefully, noting that Sharon was nowhere to be seen, but that there were 2 coffee cups on the table. Good, good. "Listen, Dad, I've been thinking about our conversation at the church, and I want to apologize. Sharon and I were out of line. You're grieving, and we shouldn't have pressured you about financial matters so soon after the funeral." This was not the Wesley I'd left at the church. That man had been aggressive, demanding, barely controlled. This version was calm, reasonable, almost solicitous. The change was so dramatic it was like talking to a different person entirely. "I appreciate that," I said, though every instinct I had was screaming that this was a performance. "I've taken the liberty of organizing some of Mom's paperwork," he continued, gesturing to the documents spread across the table. "I know finances aren't your strong suit, and I thought I could help you understand what you're dealing with. There are some decisions that need to be made soon." He stood up and pulled out a chair for me, the picture of a dutiful son helping his elderly father navigate the complexities of widowerhood. But I noticed he'd positioned himself between me and the back door, and his movements had the careful precision of someone who'd rehearsed this scene. "Sharon went to get us some dinner," he said, answering my unasked question. "Chinese food from that place on Brook Park Road you like. She should be back soon." I sat down in the chair he'd offered, noting that it gave me a clear view of the front door, but no easy escape route. The recording device in my pocket felt like it was burning against my chest. "So," Wesley said, sitting back down and picking up his pen, "why don't you tell me about Mom's safety deposit box?" "Safety deposit box," I repeated, trying to look confused while my mind raced. "I don't know anything about a safety deposit box." Wesley's pen stopped moving across the legal pad. He looked up at me with those cold eyes I was finally learning to recognize. "Come on, Dad." Mom was meticulous about paperwork. She wouldn't have kept important documents in the house where they could be damaged by fire or flood. "There has to be a box somewhere." I let my shoulders slump, playing the part of the overwhelmed widower. "Wesley, I'm telling you, I don't know. Your mother handled all the financial matters. I just worked and brought home my paycheck. She took care of everything else. The bank records show a monthly charge of $45 for box rental," Wesley said, consulting his notes. "That's been going on for 15 years. She was keeping something safe, something important." I was about to respond when Sharon walked through the back door carrying bags of Chinese takeout. She'd changed out of her funeral dress into jeans and a tight sweater, and she moved through the kitchen like she owned it, getting plates from the cabinet and pulling silverware from the drawer without asking where anything was kept. "Any luck?" she asked Wesley, unpacking containers of lo mein and sweet and sour pork. "He says he doesn't know about the safety deposit box," Wesley replied, his tone suggesting he thought I was lying. Sharon set a plate of food in front of me with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. Calvin, honey, we're just trying to help you get organized. When someone dies, there are so many details to handle. We don't want anything important to get overlooked. I picked at the food, noting how they both watched me eat. The recording device in my pocket was capturing every word, but I needed more. I needed Wesley to talk about Linda's death, about what he'd done to her medication. I keep thinking about Linda's last few weeks, I said, deliberately making my voice shaky. She was so sick. Her heart medication didn't seem to be working anymore. The doctor kept adjusting the dosage, but nothing helped. Wesley and Sharon exchanged a quick glance. It was subtle, but I caught it. Heart problems are unpredictable, Wesley said carefully. Sometimes medication just stops being effective. It's nobody's fault. But she was taking her pills religiously, I continued, watching their faces. Every morning, every evening, exactly like the doctor ordered. I don't understand why they stopped working. Medications lose effectiveness over time, Sharon said, her voice taking on a lecturing tone. Bodies develop tolerance. It's very common with elderly patients. The word elderly stung, but I pushed through it. I just keep thinking there should have been something more we could have done, some way to help her. Wesley stood up abruptly and walked to the counter, his back to me. When he spoke, his voice was tight with barely controlled emotion. She was old, Dad. She was sick. Sometimes people die and there's nothing anyone can do about it. But if someone had been giving her the wrong medication... I let the sentence hang in the air like smoke. Wesley spun around, his face flushed with anger. What are you implying? I held up my hands in a gesture of innocent confusion. Nothing, son. I'm just an old man trying to understand what happened to his wife. For a moment, the kitchen was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on Brook Park Road. Wesley stared at me with an intensity that would have been frightening if I hadn't been prepared for it. Then his phone rang. The ringtone was harsh and jarring in the quiet house. Wesley looked at the display and his face went to white. He answered on the third ring. Vincent, I told you I'd have the money by Friday. I could hear the voice on the other end, cold and professional, though I couldn't make out the words. No, you don't understand, Wesley said, his voice rising in panic. My mother just died. There's an inheritance, but it takes time to process. I just need a few more days. The voice on the other end got louder, more aggressive. Wesley walked to the far end of the kitchen, but I could still hear fragments of the conversation. Last warning. Friday or else. Know where you live. Wesley hung up and stood with his back to us, his shoulders shaking. When he turned around, the mask was completely gone. This was the real Wesley. Desperate, cornered, dangerous. You're going to help me, he said, walking back to the table. You're going to tell me where Mom hid the money, and you're going to do it right now. Wesley, I don't... Shut up, he screamed, slamming his hand on the table hard enough to make the plates jump. I know she had money saved. I know she was hiding it from me. She was always hiding things, always keeping secrets, always acting like she was better than everyone else. Sharon had gone very still, her eyes darting between Wesley and the back door. She thought she was so smart, Wesley continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than his shouting. Thought she could control me with her little lectures about responsibility and hard work. But I showed her, didn't I? I showed her who was really in control. The recording device in my pocket captured every word as my son confessed to murdering my wife. You killed her, I said quietly. Wesley smiled, and it was the most chilling expression I'd ever seen. I gave her what she deserved. She was going to cut me off, Dad. She was going to let me die rather than give me my inheritance. So I helped her along. Outside, I heard the distant sound of sirens getting closer. Marshall and his team were moving in, guided by the GPS tracker in the recording device. Justice was finally coming for Wesley Pierce. Linda was right about you, I said, standing up slowly. She knew exactly what kind of monster she'd raised. The sirens were louder now, close enough that even Wesley could hear them. His face went from triumph to panic to rage in the span of seconds. You set me up, he whispered. No, son, I said, pulling the recording device from my pocket. You did that all by yourself.